The billionaire CEO rejected his new assistant. Unknown to him, she was his childhood sweetheart who saved his life years ago. His raised hand cut through the boardroom air like a blade, the same dismissive gesture that had ended countless business deals. But the woman in the royal blue blazer standing before him had no idea she was looking at the man whose breath she'd once breathed life back into on a rain-soaked highway 10 years ago, while he lay unconscious and bleeding, never seeing the face of his guardian angel. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The 42nd floor of Sterling Industries commanded Manhattan like a steel and glass throne, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that William Sterling had earned through 20 years of ruthless ambition and calculated risks. But on this grey October afternoon, his attention wasn't on the empire sprawling below. Instead, his steel-blue eyes were fixed on the quarterly reports that validated his reputation as the youngest billionaire in commercial real estate, a title that meant more to him than the family he'd lost along the way. His corner office reflected the man he'd become, pristine, powerful, and deliberately devoid of anything that might hint at warmth or vulnerability. The awards lining his walls told the story of a self-made empire, each plaque and certificate a reminder that William Sterling answered to no one, needed no one, and trusted no one, especially not with his heart. Mr. Sterling. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, professionally neutral in the way he preferred. Margaret Chen had worked for him for 3 years, long enough to understand that efficiency mattered more than empathy in his world. Your 2 p.m. appointment is here. Should I send her in? William didn't look up from his tablet, where profit margins held more interest than the human resources interview he was obligated to conduct. His previous personal assistant had made the mistake of developing feelings, a liability he'd terminated along with her employment. This time, he'd instructed HR to find someone older, less attractive, and thoroughly professional. Someone who wouldn't complicate his carefully ordered existence. 5 minutes, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd learned that time was power, and power meant never having to explain himself to anyone. Then I have a call with Tokyo. The door opened with barely a whisper, and the soft click of heels announced his visitor's arrival. William finished scanning the last column of numbers before raising his head, a polite but dismissive rejection already forming on his lips. The words died in his throat. Standing in his doorway was a woman who made his chest constrict with recognition, so sharp it felt like physical pain. She was stunning in a way that went beyond mere beauty. Her rich, dark skin seemed to glow against the royal blue blazer that fit her like it had been tailored for royalty. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek bun that spoke of boardroom battles and hard-won respect, but he could see the natural curl that had once bounced against her shoulders when she laughed. But it was her eyes that stopped his world from spinning. Those same warm, intelligent brown eyes that had looked at him like he held the secrets to the universe, that had crinkled at the corners when she smiled, that had filled with tears the night before his parents shipped him off to boarding school 23 years ago. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice carrying a slight rasp that sent memories cascading through his mind like an avalanche. I'm Kendra Williams. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Williams, not Johnson. The name hit him like a physical blow, even as his rational mind tried to deny what his heart was screaming. This couldn't be Kendra Johnson, the girl from the wrong side of town who'd stolen his teenage heart. This polished, confident woman couldn't be the same person who'd promised to wait for him forever, who'd stopped answering his letters after 8 months of silence, who'd vanished from his life like morning mist. But those eyes. God, those eyes were exactly the same. Ms. Williams. William rose slowly, his 6'2" frame imposing in the way he'd learned to use in negotiations, though right now he felt like the 17-year-old boy who'd been torn away from the only person who'd ever loved him for who he was, not what he might become. Please, have a seat. Have you ever encountered someone from your past who completely changed the direction of your life? Share in the comments what that moment felt like. She moved with a grace that made his memory ache, settling into the chair across from his mahogany desk with the poise of someone who belonged in rooms like this. But as she placed her leather portfolio on her lap, he caught a glimpse of her hands, the same elegant fingers that had once traced patterns on his chest as they lay under the stars, planning a future that had crumbled the moment his parents discovered their relationship. Your resume is quite impressive, William managed, though he hadn't read a single word of it. His mind was too busy cataloguing the ways she'd changed and the ways she'd remained heartbreakingly the same. The professional polish couldn't hide the girl who used to sneak out of her trailer at midnight to meet him by the lake, who'd dreamed of traveling the world and making something of herself despite the circumstances of her birth. "Thank you." Kendra opened her portfolio with steady hands, though he noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the same nervous tell she'd had when she was about to say something that mattered. "I've spent the last decade in executive support roles, most recently as senior assistant to the CEO of Morrison Financial. I have extensive experience in international coordination, crisis management, and maintaining confidential communications." Her accent had been refined, the slight southern drawl she'd worked so hard to hide in high school now completely erased. But underneath the professional veneer, he could hear echoes of the girl who'd read him poetry under the old oak tree, who'd believed that love could conquer the differences in their social status, who'd cried in his arms the night before his world changed forever. "Morrison Financial," William repeated, his mind automatically filing away the information while his heart hammered against his ribs. "That's quite a leap from." He stopped himself before he could say trailer park, or the wrong side of town, or any of the other phrases that would reveal he knew exactly who she was. "From where I started." Kendra's smile was professional, but he caught the flash of something deeper in her eyes. Hurt, perhaps, or the kind of strength that came from surviving disappointments that would have broken weaker people. "Yes, it has been quite a journey." The silence stretched between them, filled with 23 years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. William found himself studying her face, looking for clues to the woman she'd become, trying to reconcile the polished professional before him with the girl who'd held his heart in her 17-year-old hands. There was something else, a shadow in her expression that spoke of experiences that went beyond corporate advancement. Her eyes held a depth that suggested she'd seen things, survived things, that had nothing to do with climbing the professional ladder. "Why Sterling Industries?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, trying to project the cool authority that had built his empire while his pulse raced like a teenager's. "You could work anywhere with your qualifications." For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and he saw something raw and vulnerable in her expression. "Sometimes you have to come full circle to understand where you belong," she said quietly, then seemed to catch herself. "What I mean is, Sterling Industries represents the kind of innovation and growth I want to be part of." It was a recovery, but not a smooth one. William had built his fortune by reading people, by recognizing the tells that revealed what they really wanted. And right now, every instinct he'd honed over 2 decades in business was telling him that Kendra Williams, if that was even her real name now, wasn't here because of his company's reputation or growth potential. She was here because of him. The realization should have made him call security, should have triggered every defensive mechanism he'd built to protect himself from exactly this kind of emotional ambush. Instead, he found himself leaning forward, drawn by the same magnetic pull that had made him risk everything for her when they were teenagers. "Tell me about crisis management," he said, watching her face carefully. "In my experience, the real test of an assistant isn't how they handle routine tasks, it's how they perform when everything falls apart." Something flickered in her eyes, gone so quickly he might have imagined it. But for just an instant, he could have sworn he saw recognition. "Pain. Memory. I've found that crisis often reveals who people really are," she said, her voice steady but laden with meaning. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is act without thinking about the consequences to yourself. Sometimes saving what matters most requires sacrifices that no one will ever know you made." The words hit him like a physical blow, though he couldn't say why. There was something in her tone, something in the way she held his gaze, that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Before he could respond, his intercom buzzed. Margaret's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Senator's office is calling. They say it's urgent regarding the infrastructure vote." William's jaw tightened. Senator Morrison controlled the committee that would decide the fate of his biggest development project, a $20 billion venture that would cement his legacy or destroy everything he'd built. It wasn't a call he could ignore, but the timing felt like cosmic cruelty. "Tell them I'll call back in 10 minutes, he said, never taking his eyes off Kendra. "We're not finished here." As Margaret's footsteps faded down the hallway, the silence returned, heavier now and charged with the weight of decisions that would reshape both their lives. Kendra sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but William could see the rapid pulse at the base of her throat, the same tell that had given away her nervousness before their first kiss. "You mentioned sacrifices," he said quietly, his business instincts warring with the part of his heart he'd thought he'd buried years ago. "What kind of sacrifices?" Her smile was soft and infinitely sad. "The kind that change everything, even when the person you saved never knows you were there." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, like a confession, like a secret that had been waiting 23 years to be spoken. William felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the walls he'd built around his heart, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't sure if he was the hunter or the prey. Because if this was really his Kendra, his first love, his greatest loss, then she hadn't just walked back into his life by accident. And the girl who'd once promised to love him forever, who'd disappeared without explanation, who'd somehow transformed herself into this confident, accomplished woman, had just hinted at a secret that might change everything he thought he knew about his own life. The smart thing would be to end this interview now, to shake her hand professionally and pretend his heart wasn't hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. But as Kendra Williams sat in his office, surrounded by all the symbols of his success, William Sterling realized that some chances only came once in a lifetime. And some people were worth any risk, even the risk of losing everything he'd spent 20 years building. But first, he had to decide, was he brave enough to find out what secrets lay behind those familiar brown eyes? Or was he still the same coward who'd let his parents tear them apart 23 years ago? The choice, like his heart, hung in the balance. The silence in the boardroom stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of unspoken truths. William Sterling sat behind his mahogany desk, a fortress of polished wood and corporate power, while across from him, Kendra Williams waited with the patience of someone who had learned that some battles required perfect timing. His phone buzzed insistently. Senator Morrison, Tokyo investors, board members who measured his worth in quarters and profit margins. But for the first time in 20 years, William Sterling couldn't bring himself to care about the empire that defined him. Because sitting 3 feet away was the ghost of every road not taken, every choice that had led him to this gilded cage of success and isolation. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority that had built his fortune, though inside, his 17-year-old heart was screaming warnings he couldn't afford to hear. "Your qualifications are impressive." The pause hung between them like a blade. Kendra's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on her portfolio, and William saw the flash of understanding in her eyes. She knew. Somehow, she knew what was coming. "However," he continued, each word feeling like a betrayal of the boy who had once promised her forever, "I don't think you're the right fit for this position." The words hit the air with the finality of a judge's gavel. In the space of that single sentence, 23 years of separation became permanent, and the last thread connecting him to the man he'd once been snapped with an audible whisper. Kendra's face remained perfectly composed, but William had once known every micro-expression that crossed her features. He saw the way her left eye twitched, barely perceptible, but unmistakably the same tell she'd had when trying not to cry. He saw how her breathing shifted, becoming carefully controlled, measured. Most of all, he saw the flash of something that looked suspiciously like disappointment. Not surprise. Not anger. Disappointment. As if she'd expected better from him. As if she'd hoped, despite everything, that he might have become the man she'd once believed he could be. "I see," she said quietly, her voice professionally neutral but carrying undertones that made his chest ache. "May I ask what concerns you might have about my qualifications? What would you do if you were facing someone from your past who didn't recognize the person you'd become? Tell us in the comments how you'd handle this moment." It was a reasonable question. A professional question. The kind any qualified candidate would ask when facing an inexplicable rejection. But William heard something else underneath. A challenge, perhaps, or a test. As if she was giving him one last chance to see her, really see her, and choose differently. He couldn't. He wouldn't. Because recognizing Kendra Johnson would mean acknowledging that the empire he built was constructed on the foundation of the heart he'd abandoned. And William Sterling had spent 20 years learning that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Your background is impressive," he said, falling back on corporate speak like armor. "But I need someone with more specific experience in my particular requirements." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Her resume was flawless, better than flawless. Any CEO in the city would hire her without hesitation. But hiring Kendra Williams would mean seeing her every day, being reminded every morning of the life he'd traded for success, of the promises he'd broken, of the boy who'd believed that love could overcome any obstacle. "I understand," she said, rising from her chair with the grace that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. She gathered her portfolio with steady hands, though he caught the slight tremor in her fingers, the same nervous energy she'd had before their first dance at junior prom, when she'd been terrified that everyone would stare at the trailer park girl dancing with the town prince. But as she stood, something shifted in her expression. The professional mask slipped for just an instant, and William saw a flash of the fire that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. The quiet strength that had made her believe she could rise above her circumstances, that had made her fight for their relationship even when his parents threatened to destroy her family's livelihood. "You know," she said, her voice carrying a new edge that made him look up sharply, "it's interesting how life works. Sometimes the people we think we need to protect ourselves from are the same ones who would have protected us when it mattered most." The words hit him like a physical blow, though he couldn't say why. There was something in her tone, something in the way she held his gaze, that made his pulse quicken with recognition he couldn't quite place. "I'm not sure I follow," he said, though every instinct was screaming that he should. Kendra's smile was soft and infinitely sad, the same expression she'd worn the night before he left for boarding school, when she'd tried so hard to be brave for both of them. 10 years ago," she said quietly, "there was a car accident on Highway 87. A bad storm, multiple vehicles involved. A man in a black Mercedes, successful, important, probably rushing to close some deal that seemed like the most important thing in the world at the time." William's blood turned to ice in his veins. Highway 87. The accident that had nearly killed him, that had left him unconscious for 3 days, that had somehow, impossibly, left him with only minor injuries despite the fact that his car had been completely destroyed. "The first responders said it was a miracle he survived," Kendra continued, her eyes never leaving his face. "But miracles sometimes have very human faces. Sometimes they look like a woman who saw a wreck and stopped to help, who climbed into a crushed car to check for survivors, who performed CPR on a stranger while the rain poured down and the paramedics fought through traffic." The room was spinning. William gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white with the effort of keeping himself upright. He remembered fragments, the screech of metal, the taste of blood, the sensation of drowning in darkness. But mostly he remembered waking up in the hospital 3 days later, alive by what the doctors called a miracle. No one had ever told him about a good Samaritan. No one had mentioned a woman who'd stopped to help. The police report had been clear. He'd been found by emergency responders, unconscious but stable, his survival attributed to the car's safety features and sheer luck. But now, looking at Kendra's face, seeing the quiet certainty in her eyes, William realized that some miracles came with deliberate anonymity. "She never gave her name," Kendra continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Never stuck around to be thanked. Just disappeared back into the storm like a guardian angel who didn't want recognition for doing what needed to be done." "Why?" William's voice cracked like a teenager's. He cleared his throat and tried again, though his world was tilting on its axis. "Why are you telling me this?" Kendra's smile held 23 years of heartbreak and hope, of loving someone from a distance, of carrying secrets that weighed more than empires. "Because sometimes," she said, gathering her purse and moving toward the door, "the most important things we do are the ones that go unrecognized. And sometimes the people we think don't fit into our carefully constructed lives are the ones who've been protecting those lives all along." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and for a moment William saw not the polished professional who'd walked into his office, but the 17-year-old girl who'd promised to love him forever. "Goodbye, William," she said softly, using his first name for the first time since she'd arrived, a small intimacy that hit him like a freight train. "I hope you find what you're looking for." The door closed behind her with the finality of a coffin lid, and William Sterling was left alone in his empire of glass and steel, surrounded by all the symbols of his success, drowning in the realization that he had just rejected the woman who had literally saved his life. His hands shook as he reached for his phone to call her back, to demand answers, to fall to his knees and beg her forgiveness. But when he pressed Margaret's extension, her voice came through with devastating efficiency. "Yes, Mr. Sterling. The woman who just left. Get me her contact information. I need to." "I'm sorry, sir, but she said to tell you she wouldn't be reachable through normal channels. Something about some roads being one-way streets." Margaret paused, and William could hear papers shuffling. She did leave this note for you, though. Should I bring it in? A note. Like the ones they used to pass in high school, before the world taught them that love was a luxury they couldn't afford. Bring it, he whispered. Margaret entered and placed a single folded piece of paper on his desk. Expensive stationery, the kind that spoke of success and careful planning. But when William unfolded it, the handwriting was achingly familiar, the same careful script that had once written "I love you" in the margins of his textbooks. William. Some chances only come once. Some truths are worth more than empires. And some people love you enough to save your life even after you've broken their heart. I kept my promise. I waited. I've been waiting for 23 years. But I won't wait forever. K. P.S. Check the hospital records from October 15, 2015. Ask them about the woman who disappeared before the reporters arrived. The note fluttered from his numb fingers to the floor, and William Sterling, billionaire, empire builder, master of his own destiny, realized that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside his windows, Manhattan pulsed with its relentless energy, millions of people pursuing their dreams and ambitions. But inside his office, time had stopped, suspended in the moment when the past collided with the present and revealed truths that could either destroy everything he'd built or give him everything he'd never known he'd lost. His intercom buzzed insistently. Tokyo was waiting. Senator Morrison was holding. Board members were depending on his decisions. The empire that defined him needed its emperor. But for the first time in 20 years, William Sterling didn't care about any of it. Because somewhere in this city was the woman who had saved his life, who had loved him first and best, who had just walked away from him for the second time. And this time, it was entirely his fault. The question was, what was he prepared to sacrifice to get her back? And more importantly, was he finally ready to become the man she'd always believed he could be? The answers lay buried in 10 years of silence, 23 years of separation, and one rain-soaked night that had changed everything, whether he'd known it or not. But first, he had to find her. And then he had to find the courage to face the truth about the night that should have ended his life, but instead gave him a second chance at the only thing that had ever really mattered. The only thing he'd been too blind to see until it was walking away from him again. The hospital records arrived at 11:47 p.m., delivered by a private courier who probably wondered why a billionaire CEO was requesting decade-old emergency room documentation at nearly midnight. William Sterling sat in his empty office, the city lights painting shadows across walls that had witnessed the building of an empire but never the breaking of a heart, until tonight. With trembling fingers that had signed billion-dollar deals without hesitation, he opened the manila envelope that contained the truth about October 15, 2015. The night that should have been his last. Patient, William J. Sterling. Admission time, 11:23 p.m. Condition, motor vehicle accident, unconscious, critical. Initial assessment, severe head trauma, internal bleeding, cardiac arrest. The clinical language made his blood run cold. He remembered none of this, just the endless darkness, then waking up 3 days later to doctors calling his survival miraculous. But as he read further, the official story began to crack like old paint. 11:35 p.m. Patient found in cardiac arrest. Unknown female civilian performing CPR at scene. Paramedic Johnson reports patient had been without pulse for approximately 4 to 6 minutes before civilian intervention. 11:52 p.m. Patient responsive to CPR efforts. Civilian female declined identification, stated just doing what anyone would do. Left scene before police interview. Medical examiner's note, without immediate CPR intervention, patient would not have survived transport to hospital. Civilian's actions directly responsible for patient survival. The folder slipped from William's hands, papers scattering across his mahogany desk like the pieces of his carefully constructed life. For 10 years, he'd believed he'd survived through luck, through the miracle of modern engineering and medical science. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. He was alive because a woman had chosen to save him, had breathed life back into his lungs while rain poured down on a dark highway. A woman who had loved him once. A woman he had rejected twice, once as a teenager, when he'd let his parents' threats tear them apart, and again today, when pride and fear had made him too blind to see the miracle sitting in his boardroom. William's phone buzzed with the harsh insistence of a world that expected him to remain its emperor even while his kingdom crumbled around him. Tokyo, London, Singapore, markets that never slept, demanding his attention. But for the first time in 20 years, he let them ring. Instead, He found himself walking to the window that had once seemed like a throne overlooking his conquered territory. Now it felt like a prison cell, 42 floors above a world where Kendra Williams was somewhere out there, carrying the weight of secrets that could have destroyed him or saved him, depending on how brave he was willing to be. What would you do if you discovered someone had been silently protecting you for years? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The security guard's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway outside his office, a lonely sound that reminded William how isolated his success had made him. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 15 years. Sterling Residence. The voice was older now, but still carried the crisp authority that had once terrified a 17-year-old boy in love. Mother. The word felt strange on his tongue after so many years of distance. A pause. William. It's nearly midnight. Has something happened to the company? Even now, she assumed crisis could only be measured in stock prices and market shares. I need to ask you about something. Before I left for boarding school. Another pause, longer this time. That was a long time ago, William. Why are you? The girl, he interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Kendra Johnson. What did you do to her? The silence stretched across the phone line like a chasm, filled with 23 years of unspoken truths. When his mother finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that had shaped both their lives. We did what was necessary to protect your future, she said quietly. That girl would have destroyed everything we'd worked to build for you. What did you do? Each word was a bullet, fired with the precision he'd learned in boardrooms but aimed at the heart of his own family. His mother's sigh carried decades of justified rationalization. Her mother worked for the Hendersons, cleaning their house. When we explained that her daughter's association with you was threatening your acceptance to Yale, threatening your entire future, she understood the situation. The room spun around William like a carousel of memories. Kendra's mother, a quiet woman who'd worked 3 jobs to keep food on their table, who'd cleaned houses for the wealthy families who wouldn't have acknowledged her humanity outside of her utility to them. You threatened her mother's job. We made it clear that certain accommodations could be made for the family if the relationship ended quietly. College funds, better employment opportunities, relocation assistance if necessary. You bought her. We saved your future. His mother's voice cracked with the passion of someone who'd convinced herself that cruelty could be love if it wore the right intentions. That girl was from nothing, William. Trailer trash with pretty eyes and big dreams. She would have trapped you, used you, destroyed every opportunity you'd been given. William closed his eyes, seeing 17-year-old Kendra in his memory. The way she'd flinched when his parents looked at her. The way she'd stopped meeting his eyes in the weeks before he left. The way she'd seemed to be carrying some unbearable weight that she couldn't share. She stopped answering my letters, he said quietly. Because she understood what we understood, that love isn't enough when it comes from different worlds. We gave her family a new start in Atlanta. Her mother got a position with better pay and benefits. Kendra got a college scholarship. Everyone won, William. Everyone won. Except the boy who'd spent 23 years wondering why the girl who'd promised to love him forever had simply vanished, as if their entire relationship had been nothing more than a teenage fantasy. Where is she now? He asked. How would I know? That was over 2 decades ago. William, why are you asking about? He hung up without answering, the phone clattering onto his desk among the scattered hospital records. His hands were shaking again, but not with fear this time, with rage. Rage at parents who'd destroyed his chance at happiness to protect a future he'd never asked for. Rage at a system that measured human worth in bank balances and zip codes. Rage at himself for being too young, too powerless, too cowardly to fight for what mattered most. But underneath the anger was something else, understanding. Understanding why Kendra's letters had stopped coming. Why she'd disappeared from his life without explanation. Why she'd spent 23 years building herself into someone who could walk into his boardroom and belong there, who could look him in the eye as an equal rather than the trailer park girl who'd been bought and dismissed. She'd kept her promise. She'd waited. Not passively, not desperately, but by becoming someone who could stand in his world without apology, who could save his life and walk away without expecting gratitude or recognition. The woman who'd left his office 6 hours ago wasn't the broken-hearted girl his parents had paid to disappear. She was something far more magnificent and terrifying. She was proof that love could survive anything, even his own blindness. But where was she now? 3 hours earlier. Kendra Williams sat in her rental car in the parking garage beneath Sterling Industries, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The professional mask she'd worn for 30 minutes in Williams' office had finally cracked, and tears she'd held back for 23 years ran down her cheeks like liquid starlight. She'd done it. She'd walked into his world, looked him in the eyes, and given him every chance to see her, to remember, to choose differently than he had when they were teenagers, and the world had seemed determined to keep them apart. And he'd chosen exactly as she'd feared he would. Not the right fit. The words echoed in her memory like stones thrown at glass. Not the right fit for the man who'd once traced her face in the moonlight and sworn that nothing would ever separate them. Not the right fit for the empire he'd built on the foundation of her broken heart. But what had she expected? That he would see through 23 years and a different name. That he would recognize the woman she'd become, the success she'd built, the life she'd crafted specifically so she could someday walk into his world as an equal. She'd been naive. Again. Her phone rang, startling her from the spiral of self-recrimination. The caller ID showed her assistant's number, probably wondering why she'd missed her evening conference call with the Morrison account. Kendra Williams. Ms. Williams, this is Rachel. I'm sorry to bother you, but Senator Morrison's office called. They are moving the meeting to tomorrow morning instead of next week. Something about expediting the infrastructure bill. Kendra closed her eyes. The Morrison account, her biggest client, the one that paid for her penthouse apartment and luxury car, the one that had taken her 8 years to land. Senator Morrison needed someone who could navigate the complex world of government relations with the skill of a diplomat and the ruthlessness of a shark. She was very good at her job. She'd had to be. Reschedule my flight, she said quietly. I'll be staying in New York for a few more days. Of course. Is everything all right? Everything was exactly as it should be. She'd gotten the closure she'd needed, the final confirmation that William Sterling was no longer the boy who'd loved her. She could go back to Atlanta, to her successful consulting firm, to the life she'd built from the ashes of teenage dreams. So why did it feel like she was dying inside? Everything's fine, Rachel. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up and sat in the silence of the parking garage, surrounded by the luxury cars of people who'd never had to choose between love and survival, who'd never had to rebuild themselves from nothing because their heart had been purchased and discarded like a commodity. But even as the pain threatened to overwhelm her, Kendra felt something else stirring in her chest, pride. She'd done it. She'd faced the man who'd shaped her entire life and walked away with her dignity intact. She'd given him the truth about that night on Highway 87, had let him know that someone had loved him enough to save his life even after he'd broken her heart. That had to be enough. It had to be. Because loving William Sterling had nearly destroyed her once. She wouldn't let it happen again. Present. William stared at his reflection in the darkened window of his office, seeing not the successful CEO the world expected, but the 17-year-old boy who'd let fear and family pressure cost him everything that mattered. He'd built an empire, but what good was it if he had no one to share it with? He'd achieved everything his parents had wanted for him, but in doing so, he'd lost the only person who'd ever loved him for who he was, not what he could become. The hospital records lay scattered on his desk like pieces of a puzzle he'd been too blind to solve. But now the picture was becoming clear. On a rain-soaked highway 10 years ago, the woman he'd lost had given him a second chance at life. And today, she'd given him a second chance at love. He'd squandered both. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late for a third chance. The first step was finding her. The second was proving that he'd finally learned the difference between what he wanted and what he needed. The third was hoping that after 23 years of waiting, Kendra Williams still believed in miracles. Because he was about to need the biggest one of his life. William Sterling, master of his own destiny, reached for his phone and began making the kind of calls that could either save everything or cost him what little soul he had left. Some gambles were worth an empire. Some people were worth even more. Dawn broke over Manhattan like a promise William Sterling had never learned to keep, painting the sky in shades of hope and desperation. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything but make phone calls and follow digital breadcrumbs through a maze of records, connections, and favors that spanned 3 decades and 2 broken hearts. Finding Kendra Williams had required every resource at his disposal: private investigators, corporate databases, hospital security footage, and the kind of influence that money couldn't buy but power could command. What he'd discovered had shattered the last of his carefully constructed illusions about the life he'd built on the grave of their love. Kendra Johnson had legally become Kendra Williams 8 years ago, not through marriage as he'd assumed, but through a legal name change that severed her final connection to the girl his parents had bought and discarded. She lived in Atlanta now, owned a boutique consulting firm that specialized in crisis management for Fortune 500 companies, and had never married, a detail that made his chest ache with possibilities he didn't deserve to hope for. But more than that, she'd been quietly, systematically, protecting him for over a decade. The private investigator's report lay spread across his desk like evidence in a trial where William Sterling stood accused of being blind to miracles. After the car accident, Kendra had somehow kept track of his movements, his business dealings, his life. When a disgruntled employee had threatened to sabotage the Chicago project 5 years ago, an anonymous tip had led security to prevent the attack. When a reporter had dug too deep into William's boarding school years, close enough to discover the truth about his parents' manipulation, the investigation had suddenly stalled when key sources became mysteriously unavailable. A dozen near disasters over the years, each one diverted by invisible hands that had belonged to a woman who'd never stopped loving him, never stopped protecting him, even after he'd failed to recognize her twice. Guardian angel. She'd been his guardian angel, and he'd been too blinded by pride and fear to see the wings. Now, at 6:23 a.m. on what might be the most important day of his life, William Sterling stood outside a hotel room door in the plaza, holding his breath and what remained of his heart. He knocked softly. Once. Twice. The door opened, and time folded in on itself like origami made of memory and regret. Kendra stood in the doorway wearing a silk robe the color of midnight, her hair loose around her shoulders in the natural curls she'd spent their teenage years trying to tame. Without makeup, without the professional armor she'd worn in his office, she looked heartbreakingly like the 17-year-old girl who'd promised to wait for him forever. "Hello, William," she said quietly, as if she'd been expecting him. As if she'd known that eventually, he would find his way to her door. "May I come in?" His voice cracked like an adolescent's, betraying the billionaire facade to reveal the boy who'd loved her first and best and never learned how to stop. She stepped aside without a word, and he entered a hotel suite that somehow felt more like home than his penthouse ever had. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the gold flecks in her eyes, the same ones he'd memorized during lazy summer afternoons when the world had seemed infinite and love had felt like the only currency that mattered. "You found me," she said, moving to the window that overlooked Central Park. Her back was to him, but he could see her reflection in the glass, guarded, beautiful, impossibly strong in a way that made his heart ache with pride and loss. "I've been looking for you for 23 years, he admitted, the words raw with honesty that felt like stepping off a cliff. "I just didn't know it until yesterday." She turned, and the smile that crossed her face was soft and infinitely sad. "No, you haven't. You've been running from me for 23 years. There's a difference." The accusation hit him like a physical blow because it was true. Every relationship he'd ended before it could get serious, every wall he'd built around his heart, every time he'd chosen ambition over connection, all of it had been about avoiding the possibility of feeling again what he'd felt for the girl who'd been ripped from his life. "I know about my parents," he said, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam. "What they did to you. To your mother. The threats, the money, the scholarship. I know why you stopped writing. Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely had been manipulating your life? Share in the comments how you'd react to that kind of betrayal." Kendra's laugh was bitter music that made his chest tight. Do you really know, or do you just know the facts?" She moved closer, and he could smell the faint scent of jasmine that had haunted his dreams for 2 decades. "Do you know what it felt like to be 17 years old and have your entire world reduced to a price tag? To realize that the boy you loved lived in a universe where your mother's job was more valuable than your heart? Kendra, do you know what it felt like to pack up everything that mattered and move to a city where no one knew your name, where you had to rebuild yourself from scratch because the person you'd been wasn't good enough for the world you wanted to belong to?" Her voice was steady, but he could see the pain in her eyes, pain he'd caused by being too young, too powerless, too cowardly to fight for her when it mattered most. "Do you know what it felt like," she continued, stepping even closer, "to spend 8 years becoming someone worthy of loving you, only to read about your engagement to Amanda Preston in the society pages?" The name hit him like a sucker punch. Amanda, the senator's daughter, the perfect merger of political influence and social standing, the woman who'd never made his pulse race but who'd looked right on his arm at charity galas and board meetings. That didn't last, he said weakly. No, it didn't. Because you sabotaged it, just like you sabotaged every relationship after it. Because you couldn't love anyone else while you were still punishing yourself for losing me. She was close enough now that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, could count the faint freckles across her nose that makeup had hidden in his office. Close enough that if he reached out, he could touch the face he'd dreamed about for 23 years. But he didn't. Because he hadn't earned that right. Not yet. The accident, he said instead, his voice barely above a whisper. October 15th, 2015. Highway 87. You were there. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe, that he'd figured it out. Or relief that the secret was finally in the open. I was driving back from a client meeting in Albany, she said quietly. The storm came out of nowhere. I saw the cars sliding, heard the impact. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. I saw the Mercedes flip. I knew before I even got out of my car. I knew it was you. How? Your license plate. Sterling 1. Subtle as always. The ghost of a smile touched her lips. I'd been following your career for years, William. I knew your car, your schedule, your route to the Albany office. I knew you well enough to know you'd be driving too fast in the rain because you were angry about something, probably the Patterson deal that had fallen through that afternoon. The Patterson deal. He'd forgotten about that, a $20 million project that had collapsed hours before the accident, sending him into a rage that had made him drive recklessly into the storm. She'd known. She'd known him well enough to predict his reactions, his choices, his flaws. She'd been watching over him like a guardian angel, and he'd never even suspected. You could have died, he said, his voice rough with emotions he didn't know how to name. The car was crushed. The fire department said anyone who tried to extract me was risking their own life. I know. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if risking her life for him had been the most natural thing in the world. But you weren't breathing. Your pulse was gone. I had maybe 2 minutes before brain damage would have been irreversible. So you climbed into a crushed car in the middle of a storm to save a man who'd broken your heart. I saved the man I'd never stopped loving, she corrected, and the simple honesty of it hit him like lightning. I saved the boy who'd held me under the stars and promised me forever. I saved the person who'd shaped every choice I'd made for 23 years, even when I was trying to forget him. Tears were running down his cheeks now, and he didn't care. 20 years of walls crumbled like sand castles before a tide, revealing the raw, aching core of everything he'd tried so hard to bury. Why didn't you tell me? He whispered. Why didn't you stay? Why didn't you let me thank you? Because you would have felt obligated to me, she said simply. Because gratitude isn't love, and I'd rather have you hate me for reasons you understood than love me for reasons that weren't real. The words hit him with the force of absolute truth. She'd saved his life and walked away because she'd loved him enough to set him free, even from the debt of his own existence. I never stopped loving you, he said, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. Not for one day, not for 1 hour. Every woman I met, I compared to you. Every choice I made, I wondered what you would think. I built an empire because I thought it would make me worthy of you, and then I used that empire to hide from the fact that I'd lost you. You didn't lose me, William. She reached up and touched his face, her palm warm against his cheek. You threw me away. Twice. Once when we were teenagers and you let your parents convince you I wasn't worth fighting for, and again yesterday when you looked at everything I'd become and decided I still wasn't good enough for your world. The accusation should have stung, but instead it felt like absolution, like the truth he'd needed to hear to finally understand the magnitude of his failures. You're right, he said, covering her hand with his. I was a coward then, and I was a coward yesterday. I was terrified that if I admitted I recognized you, I'd have to face everything I'd lost, everything I'd traded away for success that means nothing without you. And now, she asked, her voice barely audible. Now I'm more terrified of losing you again than I am of losing everything else. He turned his head to press a kiss into her palm, tasting salt and the sweetness of second chances. I'll give it all up, Kendra. The company, the money, all of it. I'll walk away from everything if it means I get to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. She pulled her hand away, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he'd lost her again. But then she smiled, the same radiant smile that had made him fall in love with her when they were 16 and the world was full of possibilities. I don't want you to give up your empire, William, she said softly. I want you to share it. I want to build something together that's bigger than what either of us could create alone. I want to be your partner, not your obligation. Yes. The word exploded from him like a prayer, like a promise, like the answer to every question he'd never known how to ask. Yes to everything. Yes to forever. Yes to the life we should have had 23 years ago, and the life we can still have if you'll give me one more chance to get it right. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body, could see the love shining in her eyes like starlight. One more chance, she whispered. But this time, when the world tries to tear us apart, you fight for us. This time, you choose love over fear. This time, he promised, pulling her into his arms, I choose you over everything. And as the morning sun painted the sky in shades of hope and redemption, William Sterling finally learned that some miracles came disguised as second chances, and some angels wore the face of the woman who'd never stopped believing in forever, even when forever seemed impossible. He kissed her then, 23 years too late and exactly on time, tasting salt and sweetness and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd lost and found again. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with its relentless energy, but inside the hotel room, time had stopped, suspended in the moment when love finally conquered fear, when the past became prologue, and when two broken hearts discovered they could still beat as one. But as they held each other in the golden morning light, neither of them noticed the phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand, or the urgent messages piling up from lawyers, board members, and reporters who'd somehow gotten wind that William Sterling's carefully controlled world was about to change forever. Some battles were worth fighting. Some loves were worth any sacrifice. And some endings were actually beginnings in disguise. 6 months later, the headlines had finally stopped screaming about the Sterling Industries scandal and started focusing on what business journalists were calling the most successful corporate restructuring in modern history. But William Sterling wasn't reading the papers as he stood in his office, their office now, watching Kendra command the boardroom like she'd been born to it. She was presenting the quarterly diversity initiative to the board of directors, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned her place through merit, not miracles. The royal blue blazer she wore was the same color as the one that had walked back into his life 9 months ago, but everything else had changed, including the woman wearing it. Kendra William Sterling. She'd taken his name 3 months ago in a ceremony that had made the society pages for all the right reasons. But more importantly, she'd transformed his company from a monument to his ego into something that actually mattered. The Atlanta Community Center broke ground last week. She was saying to the board, her presentation seamless and confident. Full funding for after-school programs, job training, and college preparation. We're not just building real estate anymore, we're building futures. Through the glass, William watched board members who'd once dismissed community outreach as soft business nod with genuine enthusiasm. Harrison Mitchell, the most conservative member of the board, was actually taking notes. 6 months ago, the same man had threatened to call an emergency meeting to remove William as CEO when the engagement announcement hit the papers. You're marrying your assistant. Mitchell had sputtered during that memorable phone call. William, the optics alone could destroy our credibility with investors. But William had learned something in the months since Kendra had walked back into his life. Some risks were worth everything, and some people were worth defending against the entire world. Harrison, he'd said with the calm authority that came from finally knowing what mattered, I'm marrying the woman who saved my life, transformed my company, and makes me a better man every day I'm with her. If the board has a problem with that, you're welcome to find a new CEO. The vote of no confidence Mitchell had threatened never materialized. Instead, something remarkable happened. Sterling Industries' stock price began climbing as investors realized that William Sterling's personal transformation had become professional innovation. Under Kendra's influence, the company had pivoted from simple real estate development to comprehensive community building. They still made billions, but now they also funded scholarships, created affordable housing, and invested in the kinds of neighborhoods that reminded William of where Kendra had grown up, places where dreams lived in trailer parks and hearts bigger than bank accounts. The woman presenting to his board wasn't just his wife. She was his partner in every sense that mattered, the missing piece that had turned his empire from a monument to loneliness into a legacy of hope. The numbers speak for themselves, Kendra continued, advancing to her final slide. Community investment doesn't just create goodwill, it creates sustainable growth. When we invest in people, they invest in us. It's not charity, it's smart business. William smiled as he recognized his own words from their late-night strategy sessions, when she'd helped him understand that success measured only in dollars was just another form of poverty. She'd taken his cynical business philosophy and infused it with the heart he'd forgotten he possessed. The meeting ended with unanimous approval for the next phase of community initiatives, and as board members filed out, their conversations were animated with possibilities rather than complaints. Mitchell stopped at the door, his expression grudgingly respectful. "Your wife has quite a vision, William," he said, and the admission cost him something. "I have to admit, I was wrong about the direction you were taking the company." "We were all wrong about a lot of things," William replied, watching Kendra gather her presentation materials with the efficiency he'd fallen in love with all over again. "Sometimes it takes the right person to help you see clearly." As the last board member left, Kendra looked up and caught his eye through the glass. Her smile was radiant, triumphant, and infinitely loving, the same expression she'd worn in the hospital chapel where they'd been married, when she'd promised to love him through whatever storms lay ahead. There had been storms. The media scrutiny when their relationship became public. The whispers about the trailer park Cinderella, who'd seduced the billionaire CEO. The ugly speculation about ulterior motives and calculated seduction. But William had learned to fight for what mattered, and Kendra had learned that she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. Together, they'd weathered every attack with the grace that came from knowing their love was built on truth, tested by time, and strengthened by the challenges they'd overcome. "How did it go?" he asked as she entered his office, though he'd watched the entire presentation through the glass. "Better than expected," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk, the same chair where she'd sat 9 months ago, hoping he would recognize her. "Mitchell actually asked if I'd consider running for the Community Development Board. And I told him I'd think about it." She smiled, the expression holding depths of possibility he was still discovering. After all, someone needs to make sure these corporate types don't forget where they came from. William came around his desk and pulled her into his arms, marveling again at how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to hold her after 23 years of empty embraces. "I love you," he said, the words as natural as breathing now, though it had taken him months to say them without the weight of decades pressing down on his chest. "I know," she whispered against his ear. "You show me every day." It was true. Love, he'd learned, wasn't just words or grand gestures. It was the 100 small choices he made daily to put her happiness alongside his own. It was consulting her on every major decision, not because he had to, but because her wisdom made him wiser. It was learning to see the world through her eyes, understanding that success meant different things to different people, and that the best victories were the ones they won together. Their intercom buzzed, and Margaret's voice came through with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd adapted beautifully to the changes in their lives. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling, the car is ready for your 3 o'clock appointment." The appointment. William felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Anticipation mixed with old pain, hope threaded through with the fear of disappointment. "Ready?" Kendra asked, reading his expression with the intuition that still amazed him. "As ready as I'll ever be," he said, though they both knew this was the conversation he'd been avoiding for 23 years. The drive to Westchester took 40 minutes through traffic that seemed determined to give William time to change his mind. But with Kendra's hand in his, her wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, he felt capable of facing anything, even the parents who'd shaped his life by nearly destroying the best part of it. Sterling Manor sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured grounds that had once represented everything William thought he wanted: prestige, history, the weight of generational wealth and social standing. Now, looking at the imposing Georgian columns and precisely trimmed hedges, he saw something else, a beautiful prison where love had been sacrificed on the altar of respectability. "We can leave," Kendra said quietly as their driver pulled up the circular drive. "We don't have to do this." "Yes, we do." William squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her presence. "They need to meet the woman I married. They need to understand what they cost all of us." His mother was waiting in the formal sitting room, her silver hair perfectly styled, her expression carefully neutral. Catherine Sterling had aged well, her beauty preserved by expensive treatments and the kind of self-discipline that had made her a force in New York society for 4 decades. But William saw something new in her eyes as they were announced: uncertainty. For the first time in his life, his mother wasn't sure how to control the narrative. "William," she said, rising with the grace that had been bred into her bones. You look well. Mother. He didn't move to embrace her, but his voice was steady, professional. I'd like you to meet my wife, Kendra. The pause that followed was loaded with 23 years of history, manipulation, and consequences. Catherine Sterling's eyes moved over Kendra with the assessing gaze of someone who'd spent decades evaluating threats to her family's status. But what she saw wasn't the frightened 17-year-old girl she'd bought and dismissed. This was a woman who belonged in rooms like this, who carried herself with the confidence that came from earning her place rather than inheriting it. Mrs. Sterling, Kendra said, extending her hand with perfect poise. Thank you for agreeing to see us. Please, sit. Catherine's voice carried the same authority that had once terrorized a teenage boy in love, but now it seemed diminished somehow, uncertain of its power. I must say, I was surprised by the wedding announcement. What would you say to someone who had tried to control your life for their own purposes? Let us know in the comments how you'd handle meeting them after finding your own success. I imagine you were, William said, settling beside Kendra on the antique sofa where he'd once been lectured about duty, responsibility, and the importance of marrying within their social circle. Just as surprised as I was to learn what you did to Kendra's family 23 years ago. His mother's composure cracked slightly, revealing the woman behind the society mask. We did what we thought was best. You bought her, William interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd finally learned to use his power for protection rather than acquisition. You threatened her mother's livelihood to force a 17-year-old girl out of my life. She wasn't right for you, William. You were young, infatuated. I was in love, he said quietly, with the most remarkable woman I'd ever met. A woman who could have been your daughter-in-law 23 years ago if you'd taken 5 minutes to see who she really was instead of where she came from. Catherine's eyes moved between them, and William saw the moment she began to understand the magnitude of what her manipulation had cost them all. Not just the lost years, but the grandchildren she might have had, the family dinners that could have been, the legacy of love that had been traded for the preservation of social standing. I thought, she began, then stopped, her voice breaking slightly. I thought I was protecting your future. You destroyed it, William said, but without the anger that had burned in him for months after learning the truth. Time and Kendra's grace had taught him that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. It was about refusing to let old wounds poison new possibilities. But it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what we do from here. Kendra shifted beside him, and when she spoke, her voice carried the wisdom that had made him fall in love with her all over again. Mrs. Sterling, she said quietly, I didn't come here to relitigate the past. I came because William loves you, and because family, even complicated family, matters to both of us. The simple generosity of the statement hit Catherine like a physical blow. Here was the woman she'd dismissed as unworthy, offering grace instead of recrimination, inclusion instead of revenge. I don't understand, Catherine whispered. We're building something new, Kendra continued, her hand finding William's and holding tight. A marriage, a business, a legacy that honors both where we came from and where we're going. But we can't do that while carrying resentment for choices that can't be changed. What are you saying? William looked at his mother, really looked at her for the first time in years, and saw not the formidable society matron who'd controlled his childhood, but an aging woman who'd made terrible choices out of love and fear, who'd sacrificed relationship for reputation and discovered too late that the trade hadn't been worth it. We're saying that if you're willing to accept Kendra as your daughter-in-law, really accept her, not tolerate her, then we'd like you to be part of our lives, he said. But it has to be real, Mother. It has to be based on who we are now, not who you thought we should be. Catherine Sterling sat in silence for a long moment, her composed facade crumbling as she faced the choice that would define the rest of her relationship with her son. She could cling to old prejudices and lose him forever, or she could embrace the woman who'd made him whole and discover what real family looked like. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I was wrong. About her, about you, about what mattered. She looked directly at Kendra, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry for what I took from both of you. We got it back, Kendra said simply. Love like ours doesn't disappear. It just waits for the right moment to bloom again. And as his mother wept for 23 years of separation, William Sterling finally understood that some victories required defeating the enemy, while others required transforming them into family. 1 year later, the community center in Atlanta buzzed with the controlled chaos of a grand opening, But William only had eyes for the woman cutting the ceremonial ribbon. Kendra stood in front of the building they'd designed together, surrounded by children whose dreams would be nurtured within its walls, and she was radiant. The center bore both their names, the Sterling Williams Community Initiative, a testament to the partnership that had transformed not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they touched. It offered after-school programs, job training, college preparation, and most importantly, the message that where you started didn't determine where you could go. Ready? Kendra asked, holding the oversized scissors and grinning at him with the joy that made every day feel like a celebration. With you. I'm ready for anything. She cut the ribbon, and as the crowd cheered, William felt something he'd never experienced in all his years of corporate victories. The satisfaction that came from building something that would outlast them both, something that mattered beyond profit margins and stock prices. Later, as they walked through the center's bright hallways, William marveled at how far they'd traveled from that boardroom where she'd first walked back into his life. They'd built more than a marriage. They'd built a mission, a purpose that gave meaning to every decision they made. What are you thinking about? Kendra asked, catching him staring at her again. Just, all of it. The accident, the second chances, the way you saved my life in more ways than one. He pulled her into his arms in the empty hallway, not caring if anyone saw them. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been on that highway 10 years ago? Every day, she admitted. But I've learned that some things are meant to be, even when they take the long way around. Maybe we needed those 23 years apart to become the people we are today. Maybe we needed to lose each other to understand how precious this is. Maybe, William agreed, pressing his forehead against hers. Or maybe we just got lucky enough to have a guardian angel who believed in second chances. Third chances, she corrected with a smile. Don't forget you rejected me twice. Never again, he promised, the words carrying the weight of every vow he'd ever made. From now on, I choose you. Every day, every decision, every moment, I choose you. Good, she whispered, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. Because I've been waiting 23 years to hear you say that and mean it. As the sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of hope and redemption, William Sterling held his wife in the community center they'd built together and understood finally that some love stories don't end. They just begin again, deeper and stronger than before. Outside, the city hummed with its relentless energy, but inside the building that would change countless lives, time stood still. Suspended in the moment when the past became prologue, when broken hearts learned to beat as one, and when two people who'd been separated by fear and manipulation proved that love, real love, could overcome anything. Even the distance between a billionaire's penthouse and a trailer park. Even 23 years of separation. Even the mistakes that had cost them half their lives. Some miracles came disguised as accidents on rain-soaked highways. Others came wearing royal blue blazers and carrying resumes that told only half the story. But the greatest miracle of all was learning that it's never too late to choose love over fear, to fight for what matters, and to discover that the person you've been looking for your entire life has been looking for you too, waiting with the patience of angels and the faith of someone who knows that true love always finds a way home. William Sterling had built an empire, but he'd found something infinitely more valuable, a partnership that would last forever, a love that had survived everything the world could throw at it, and a woman who'd proven that the best guardian angels don't have wings. They have hearts big enough to save the world, one broken soul at a time. And as they walked hand in hand through the community center that bore both their names, William finally understood that some stories don't end with happily ever after. They end with happily ever beginning, because the best love stories are the ones that create new chapters every single day. The boy who'd lost his first love had become a man who'd found his soulmate. The girl who'd been bought and dismissed had become a woman who couldn't be conquered or contained. Together, they built something beautiful from the ashes of what could have been. And in doing so, they'd proven that love doesn't just conquer all. Sometimes, it saves everything.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.